A soldier vanished on the Italian front in 1945. More than 70 years later, the question is no longer how he died, but why it took so long to say his name. In United States Army Records VFC, Maceo A, Walker appears only as a faded line under missing in action. No marked grave, no family story carried forward. That silence breaks when an official letter is sent, addressed to Spike Lee, a contemporary American figure, unexpectedly identified as the closest living relative of a soldier history never properly recorded. Before his name was reduced to a bureaucratic status, before it appeared in capital letters beneath the phrase, "Missing in Action Maceo A," Walker existed in a far quieter register of history. He was not born into prominence or promise. He was born into routine. His early life unfolded in Baltimore, in a household where stability was hard-earned and rarely discussed. His father worked as a caretaker, a job defined by physical endurance and long hours, often invisible to those whose spaces he maintained. It was work that offered no upward trajectory, only continuity. From his father, Maceo learned the value of reliability long before he understood its cost. Their home was modest, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. Space was shared. Privacy was limited. Conversations were practical. Dreams, if spoken at all, were framed carefully, so they did not sound like complaints. In that environment, Maceo grew into a young man who did not expect more than what effort could reasonably secure. He was the only son, and that status carried both pride and pressure. He was expected to be present, to contribute, and eventually to improve the conditions his parents had endured. When the United States entered the war, the news arrived in Baltimore as it did everywhere else, but its implications were different for black families. Service promised wages, structure, and recognition. Yet it also reinforced the reality that citizenship did not guarantee equality. Newspapers spoke of freedom abroad, while segregation persisted at home. For many young men, enlistment was not a declaration of idealism, but a calculation shaped by limited options. Maceo enlisted in 1943. He was 20 years old. There is no surviving account of a dramatic farewell or a decisive speech. His departure was quiet, marked by practicality rather than ceremony. Army intake records describe him in measured terms: 5 feet 8 inches tall, average build, no distinguishing scars or marks. These descriptors, designed for identification and control, would later take on an unintended weight. They would become among the few surviving anchors to his physical presence. Training introduced him to a new form of order. Days were structured down to the minute. Instructions were clear but impersonal. Individual preferences dissolved into collective motion. For many recruits, the loss of autonomy was jarring. For Maceo, it was familiar. He had grown up navigating systems where compliance was safer than resistance. The Army did not teach him discipline. It formalized it. What distinguished him was not ambition, but consistency. He was not known to seek attention or advancement. He followed instructions precisely. He kept his equipment clean. Fellow soldiers later recalled his habit of polishing his boots before roll call, even when conditions made such effort seem pointless. It was not vanity. It was routine, a small assertion of order in an environment that rarely offered it. Letters home became his primary connection to the life he had left behind. They were brief, restrained, and reassuring. He wrote about weather, about training schedules, about waiting. He did not describe fear or exhaustion, though both were almost certainly present. He asked after his parents. He promised to return. In his correspondence, the future remained intact, an assumption that neither he nor his family had reason to question. For his father, these letters served as proof of continuity. Each envelope confirmed that his son still existed somewhere beyond the horizon of daily labor. Delays were unsettling but tolerable. Silence, however, was not yet a threat. At this stage of the war, hope remained procedural. As long as letters arrived, the system appeared to be functioning. Assignment to the 92nd Infantry Division placed Maceo within a unit that carried historical weight but limited institutional trust. The Buffalo Soldiers were celebrated in name and questioned in practice. While the rank and file were black, senior command positions were largely held by white officers, many of whom doubted the division's combat readiness before it ever saw action. These assumptions shaped training, evaluation, and ultimately deployment. Maceo was not positioned to challenge those dynamics. He moved through them quietly, focused on immediate tasks rather than structural injustice. His role was not to interpret history, but to survive it. He cleaned his rifle meticulously. He memorized procedures. He waited for orders and followed them. Deployment to Italy transformed abstraction into geography. The journey across the Atlantic marked a physical separation from everything familiar. The climate was different. The terrain was unfamiliar. Mountains replaced streets. Mud replaced pavement. Italy was not a romantic landscape. It was wet, cold, and unstable. For soldiers accustomed to urban environments, the terrain itself felt hostile. Combat training gave way to lived uncertainty. The distinction between preparation and execution blurred quickly. Instructions were often overtaken by circumstance. Artillery fire rendered theory obsolete. Movement became reactive. In this environment, personal habits gained new significance. Small routines offered continuity when larger structures failed. Maceo carried his identification tags close to his body as required. He also carried a folded photograph of his family creased from repeated handling. These objects served no tactical purpose, yet they mattered. They anchored him to a version of himself that existed beyond the uniform. They affirmed that his life had context, that it extended backward, and he believed forward. There is no record of him speaking about fear. There is no testimony of heroism or panic. His presence is inferred through absence, through the lack of disciplinary action, through the lack of commendation. He occupied the vast, unremarked space where most soldiers lived, contributing to collective effort without individual recognition. At home, the war progressed through mediated forms, radio broadcasts, newspaper headlines, rumors carried by neighbors. His father followed these developments cautiously. He understood that statistics did not translate cleanly into personal outcomes. As long as letters arrived, the war remained distant. This period represents the last moment when Maceo A. Walker existed fully within his own life, rather than within history's margins. He was not yet defined by disappearance. He was defined by routine expectation, and the assumption that endurance would be rewarded with return. That assumption was shared. It was embedded in every letter he sent, and every letter his father received. It shaped plans that were never written down, but fully believed. Employment after the war, a better apartment, stability earned through sacrifice. None of these expectations accounted for uncertainty without resolution. Families were prepared for loss. They were not prepared for ambiguity. Maceo did not write as someone anticipating erasure. He wrote as someone moving through obligation toward continuity. His future, as he imagined it, remained ordinary. And it was precisely that ordinariness, the lack of dramatic expectation, that would make his eventual absence so difficult to reconcile. This is the version of Maceo A. Walker that precedes silence. A young man formed by labor, shaped by discipline, and sustained by the belief that participation would lead back home. Before he became a question, he was a presence. Before history lost him, he belonged fully to a family that believed they would see him again. The moment when Maceo A. Walker disappeared did not arrive with ceremony. There was no single instant preserved in testimony, no definitive witness who could later say what he saw. His absence entered the record quietly folded into paperwork, completed under pressure, written by men whose primary obligation was not memory but momentum. By early February 1945, the 92nd Infantry Division had been operating along the northern Italian coast for months, under conditions that tested even seasoned units. The terrain near the Cinque Canal offered little cover and less margin for error. Waterlogged ground slowed movement. German artillery dominated key elevations. Orders shifted rapidly as positions were gained, lost, and regained in cycles that blurred into exhaustion. On paper, the operation had structure. In practice, it dissolved into fragmentation. During the fighting near the canal, communication failed repeatedly. Units lost visual contact with one another. Radio lines went silent or carried outdated instructions. Soldiers advanced without knowing whether adjacent units were still in place. Retreats were executed under fire, often without clear paths of withdrawal. In such conditions, accountability became approximate. At the end of each day, company commanders were required to submit casualty reports. These documents were never intended to be comprehensive narratives. They were instruments of administration designed to track numbers rather than lives. The officer responsible for Maceo's company was in his 30s, overworked and operating with incomplete information. He could confirm some losses, others remained unresolved. For Maceo A. Walker, there was no body recovered, no confirmation of capture. No witness who could state with certainty where he had last been seen. The space between those absences was filled with a single designation, missing in action. That phrase carried specific procedural meaning. It allowed the Army to acknowledge uncertainty while maintaining forward motion. It deferred resolution. It transferred responsibility from the battlefield to the archive. For the institution, it was a functional category. For families, it was an indefinite suspension. The report moved upward through channels. Battalion, regiment, division. Each layer removed context while preserving designation. By the time the information reached central records, Maceo A, Walker existed only as a name associated with a status. The circumstances of his disappearance were no longer active questions. They were administrative footnotes. The war continued. In the months that followed, the 92nd Division sustained further losses. Attention shifted to new operations. The Sinkwall Canal became one engagement among many. Individual soldiers disappeared into aggregate statistics. Accountability focused on outcomes rather than particulars. After the war ended, graves registration teams returned to former battlefields to recover remains. Their work was systematic but constrained. They relied on battlefield maps, witness statements, and the condition of the remains themselves. In many cases, bodies had been moved, buried hastily, or destroyed by artillery. Identification depended heavily on metal identification tags and intact uniforms. For soldiers killed by direct artillery, impact recovery was often incomplete. Bodies were fragmented. Personal effects were destroyed. Identification tags were lost. In such cases, remains were sometimes collected without attribution and later interred as unknowns. The area around the Sinkwall Canal produced several such recoveries. These remains were eventually transferred to permanent American cemeteries in Italy. Headstones were placed. Where names could not be assigned, the stones read simply, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier, known but to God." The language suggested reverence, but it also signaled finality. Unknowns were considered resolved cases. For Maceo Walker, this process produced no closure. Back in Baltimore, his family waited. The Army did not immediately declare him dead. Instead, official correspondence informed them that he was missing. The distinction mattered. As long as a soldier was listed as missing, hope remained institutionally sanctioned. Families were instructed to wait. Waiting became a form of discipline. Months passed. Letters stopped arriving. Then eventually, a final notification arrived, stating that no further information was available. The absence was formalized but not explained. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no narrative to share with neighbors or future generations. Without ritual, grief became unstructured. For Black families in particular, the war's end did not usher in clarity. Many veterans returned to segregation, limited employment, and unfulfilled promises. For families of the missing, the situation was more ambiguous. They were asked to absorb loss without confirmation, to mourn without evidence. Over time, silence replaced uncertainty. In many households, the missing were spoken of less frequently as years passed. Not because they were forgotten, but because there was no language to accommodate unresolved absence. Children grew up without knowing names. Stories were truncated. Pain was contained. In the Walker family, Maceo's name gradually disappeared from conversation. His father aged. Responsibilities shifted. The practical demands of survival left little room for prolonged mourning. There was no grave to anchor memory, no anniversary to mark. Silence became a form of inheritance. Institutionally, the case was dormant. Maceo remained listed as missing one among thousands from the Second World War. Over time, resources shifted to newer conflicts. Records aged. Witnesses died. The likelihood of resolution diminished with each passing year. What remained were documents, casualty reports, unit histories, maps marked with outdated coordinates. These materials preserved fragments but not coherence. They recorded that something had happened without explaining what. For the 92nd Division, historical assessment compounded the erasure. Post-war evaluations often emphasized perceived failures while downplaying context. Losses were interpreted through the lens of bias. Individual soldiers became abstractions within broader judgments. This climate did not encourage re-examination. As decades passed, the absence of resolution became normalized. Missing soldiers were absorbed into historical margins. Their families adapted. Their names receded from public consciousness. The silence was not accidental. It was produced by structure. Bureaucracy prioritized closure over accuracy. Racial bias influenced which stories were revisited and which were allowed to settle. Families lacking power or trust in institutions often disengaged. The result was a layered disappearance, first from the battlefield, then from records, then from memory. Maceo A. Walker did not vanish once. He vanished repeatedly. Each repetition made retrieval more difficult. By the time the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency would later reopen cases from the Second World War, the distance between event and investigation spanned generations. What had once been a missing soldier became a missing narrative. Yet absence leaves traces. The designation missing in action did not erase the fact that Maceo had existed, that he had served, that he had been present at a specific place and time. It merely deferred acknowledgement. The silence that followed was not proof of insignificance. It was evidence of neglect. This act of the story does not resolve his fate. It explains how resolution was postponed, how a life could be suspended between categories, how a family could lose a son without ever being told how. The silence surrounding Maceo Walker was not the result of a single failure. It was the accumulation of many small omissions, each justified in isolation and devastating in total. By the time history would attempt to speak again, the ground itself would have to be questioned. Silence does not end on its own. It is usually interrupted. For more than 7 decades after the war, Maceo A. Walker existed only as a suspended record. His name remained in military databases unchanged, periodically reviewed, but never resolved. The case was neither closed nor active. It rested in a category designed for endurance rather than urgency. Over time, the file accumulated age without accumulating meaning. What altered that status was not a discovery in the field or a newly unearthed document, but a letter. In the early years of the 21st century, analysts working with the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency began revisiting unresolved Second World War cases connected to segregated units. The 92nd Infantry Division drew particular attention, not because its losses were unique, but because so many of its missing were presumed to lie among the unknowns already buried in American cemeteries overseas. The shift in approach was subtle, but consequential. Instead of asking where bodies might still be lost, investigators began asking whether bodies had already been found but never named. This reframing required genealogical reconstruction. If remains were to be identified, living relatives would be necessary. DNA comparison demanded reference samples, and reference samples required families. That meant tracing lineages across decades marked by migration, name changes, and silence. Maceo Walker's case resurfaced during this process. At first, the file offered little guidance. He had no children. His parents were long deceased. Siblings, if any, were not immediately apparent. For many missing soldiers, this is where the search stalled. Families had fragmented. Records had thinned. Memory had failed. But genealogy does not depend on memory alone. It depends on patterns. Researchers traced census data, birth records, and marriage certificates. They followed names that diverged and converged. Slowly, a family tree reemerged, branching outward rather than downward. One branch led to a familiar name, Spike Lee. At the time the connection was identified, Lee was a public figure whose work had repeatedly engaged with questions of Black history, war, and memory. Yet this particular history had never surfaced within his own family narrative. The discovery did not confirm something known. It introduced something entirely absent. The Army drafted a formal notification. The letter was written in neutral language. It explained that Lee had been identified as the closest living relative of a soldier missing from the Second World War. It included a name, a rank, and a unit. It requested contact. When Lee received the letter, the name meant nothing to him. There was no recollection of a relative named Maceo Walker. No family story, no photograph tucked away. The absence was immediate and disorienting. How could a family lose knowledge of a person entirely? Initial reaction gave way to verification. Lee consulted relatives. No one recognized the name. Genealogical explanation followed. Walker was the son of Lee's grandfather's sister. A connection close enough to matter, distant enough to disappear when unspoken. The silence was not intentional. It was inherited. For Lee, the discovery collided with professional history. Years earlier, he had directed Miracle at Street, Anna, a film centered on Buffalo soldiers fighting in Italy. The project had required extensive research. He had walked the terrain. He had studied the division's battles. He had told a story rooted in sacrifice and neglect. He had not known he was standing inside his own family's erased past. The coincidence was unsettling but not mystical. It revealed something structural. History had been available to him as subject matter but inaccessible as inheritance. The distance between public memory and private knowledge had been complete. After initial contact, the Army explained what was being asked. Participation was voluntary. DNA samples could be provided to assist in identification. There was no guarantee of outcome. The process could take years. Lee agreed. His decision carried weight beyond the case itself. For investigators, it meant the Walker file could move forward. For other families, it meant visibility. The involvement of a public figure did not change scientific standards, but it changed perception. It signaled that the process was not merely symbolic. The moment marked a transition in the narrative. For the first time since 1945, Maceo Walker was no longer solely a subject of record. He had re-entered a living family structure, however tentatively. The discovery also reframed earlier silence. What had once appeared as forgetting now appeared as compression. Pain had not been resolved. It had been contained. In many black families, unresolved wartime loss existed alongside post-war discrimination, economic precarity, and migration. Silence functioned as survival, not denial. Lee described the experience as disorienting rather than emotional. Grief requires memory. Here, memory had to be constructed retroactively. He was being asked to feel responsibility before feeling loss. The Army's outreach continued in parallel. Investigators contacted other potential relatives connected to the narrowed group of unknown remains. Responses varied. Some families declined. Some expressed skepticism. Others required time. The requirement that at least half of identified families provide DNA before remains could be exhumed slowed the process. It was designed to prevent unnecessary disturbance of graves. It also reflected an ethical threshold. Identification had to be plausible before action was taken. In this context, Lee's participation mattered. It reduced uncertainty. It increased confidence. It moved the case from theoretical to actionable. Yet the discovery did not resolve the central questions. It shifted them. How had a man's existence vanished so completely from his family's awareness? Why had no one spoken his name? What did it mean to recover a story that had never been told? The answers lay not in individual failure, but in historical pressure. Segregated service, biased reporting, unmarked graves, post-war silence. Each layer contributed to erasure. Modern discovery did not correct the past. It illuminated it. For DPAA analysts, the case exemplified a broader pattern. Many of the missing from segregated units had been absorbed into anonymity, not because they were unrecoverable, but because the systems responsible for recovery had not prioritized them. Time had compounded that neglect. Reopening the file did not guarantee identification. It guaranteed effort. As the process advanced, Walker's name began to appear in new contexts. Press inquiries followed. Public attention increased. The case became a symbol, though investigators resisted that framing. For them, it remained one case among many governed by evidence rather than narrative. Still, narrative has force. The rediscovery of Maceo Walker disrupted the long equilibrium of absence. It forced institutions to revisit assumptions. It forced families to confront gaps they had not known existed. It demonstrated that silence, even when normalized, could be interrupted. This act of the story does not deliver resolution. It marks recognition. For the first time since his disappearance, Maceo A. Walker was being actively sought not as an abstraction, but as a person with living kin. His name was spoken aloud in rooms where decisions were made. His file was no longer dormant. The silence had been broken not by chance, but by deliberate inquiry. What followed would depend on science, cooperation, and time, but the threshold had been crossed. History, which had once misplaced him, was now asking where to return him. History, when it returns, does not do so in words. It returns in fragments. For the defense, POW, and MIA accounting agency, reopening the case of Maceo A. Walker meant transitioning from archival silence to physical matter. Files could be reread indefinitely. Genealogies could be reconstructed. But confirmation required something else entirely remains that could be tested, measured, and compared. The working assumption guiding the 92nd Infantry Division project was both pragmatic and unsettling. Many missing soldiers from the division were not lost in unrecovered battlefields. They were already buried unnamed beneath uniform headstones in American cemeteries overseas. Their anonymity was not the result of disappearance, but of misidentification or non-identification during the chaotic months following the war. The Florence American Cemetery held several such unknowns. Among them was a set of remains catalogued as X124. The designation carried no story. It was an internal identifier assigned decades earlier when the remains were reinterred. At the time, it marked closure. For modern investigators, it marked possibility. The remains associated with X124 had been recovered from the general vicinity of the Cinquale Canal shortly after the war's end. Original recovery notes were sparse, written by graves registration personnel, operating under pressure with limited resources and incomplete information. The body was not intact. Identification tags were absent. Uniform fragments offered no unique identifiers. As a result, the remains were classified as unknown and buried accordingly. What changed decades later was context. Through cross-referencing casualty reports, unit movements, and recovery locations, DPAA historians narrowed the field of potential identities associated with the Cinquale recoveries. Maceo Walker's name consistently appeared within that narrowed group. His reported disappearance aligned geographically and temporally with the recovery site. Still, alignment was not identification. Before exhumation could be approved, several conditions had to be met. Families had to be identified. DNA reference samples had to be collected. The probability of meaningful comparison had to justify disturbance of a grave. Once those thresholds were reached, permission was granted. The exhumation took place quietly. There was no ceremony, no press. The process was treated as technical rather than symbolic. Cemetery staff removed the headstone. Archaeologists documented soil layers. Each step was photographed, logged, and reviewed. What emerged was incomplete. The remains consisted primarily of pelvic bones and lower limbs. The skull was absent. The rib cage was absent. Upper extremities were missing. The distribution of surviving elements suggested a high-energy blast consistent with artillery fire. In such events, the upper body often absorbs the force, while lower portions are shielded by terrain or positioning. This pattern matched battlefield accounts from the Cinquale sector. The remains were transported to the DPAA laboratory at Offutt Air Force Base for analysis. Their forensic anthropologists began the slow work of reconstruction. Measurements were taken. Age estimates were calculated based on bone development and wear. Stature was approximated using established formulas applied to femur length. The estimated height was approximately 5 feet 8 inches. Age at death was assessed as early adulthood, consistent with a man in his late teens or early 20s. None of these data points were definitive. Taken together, they formed a profile, a body without a name, but not without parameters. The condition of the remains complicated analysis. Missing skeletal elements limited comparative opportunities. Dental records, often critical for identification, were unavailable. Trauma analysis could describe mechanism, but not identity. This is where DNA became essential. From the preserved bone, technicians extracted genetic material. Time, moisture, and burial conditions had degraded the sample. Recovery required careful processing. Even then, the resulting genetic profile would likely be partial. Mitochondrial DNA was prioritized. Unlike nuclear DNA, it persists longer and can be matched across maternal lines. It does not provide unique identification on its own, but it can exclude or support hypotheses. Reference samples from family members were processed in parallel. The comparison phase was slow. Analysts reviewed results conservatively. Statistical thresholds had to be met. Probabilities were calculated and recalculated. No single test delivered an answer. Identification emerged only when multiple independent lines of evidence converged. Throughout the process, uncertainty was not a flaw. It was acknowledged and documented. Dr. Sarah Barksdale, the project's lead historian, reviewed the case continuously. Her role was not to confirm identity, but to ensure historical coherence. Did the forensic findings contradict known records? Did they align with unit movements? Were there alternative explanations that had not been ruled out? The question was never whether X124 could be Maceo Walker. The question was whether it could be anyone else. As analysis continued, pressure mounted quietly. Families waited. Investigators resisted speculation. Public interest, once ignited, had to be managed carefully. Premature conclusions could cause harm. In the laboratory, the remains remained silent. Forensic reconstruction does not restore a person. It translates physical evidence into probabilities. It narrows uncertainty. It does not resolve loss. What it offers is attribution, the return of a name to matter that has endured without one. The condition of X124 forced confrontation with the realities of artillery warfare. The body had not been preserved for recognition. It had been preserved by accident. Mud, terrain, and chance had protected fragments long enough for modern science to intervene. That intervention, however, came with limits. Even if identification were confirmed, much would remain unknown. The exact moment of death, the position of the body, whether Maceo Walker was alone or among others. Forensic science could approach these questions, but not answer them fully. What it could do was counter erasure. In institutional terms, this mattered. Unknowns represent unresolved obligations. They occupy space in cemeteries, but not in histories. Naming them restores accountability. It acknowledges that loss was specific, not abstract. The Walker case exemplified the stakes of this work. It was not about recovery from wilderness or wreckage. It was about reevaluating decisions made under duress decades earlier and correcting what could still be corrected. As analysis continued, the remains of X124 became the focal point of intersecting timelines. 1945 and the present converged in a laboratory where bone fragments were measured, cataloged, and compared. The process was not dramatic. It was meticulous. Days passed without visible progress. Reports were written, reviewed, revised. Doubt was treated as discipline. For the family, updates were sparse. Investigators communicated cautiously. No promises were made. The language remained conditional. For history, however, something had shifted. A body that had once been declared unknowable was now under active consideration. Its anonymity was no longer accepted as final. This act of the story does not declare identity. It establishes the conditions under which identity might be claimed. It replaces assumption with analysis. It subjects silence to scrutiny. Whether X124 would ultimately be named Maceo A, Walker remained undecided at this stage. What was clear was that the process itself had meaning. It demonstrated that absence could be challenged, that time did not nullify obligation. Forensic reconstruction is not closure. It is accountability applied to matter. And in that accountability, the possibility of return begins not as memory, but as fact. Forensic science can reconstruct bone, but it cannot reconstruct trust. As the case of Maceo A. Walker advanced through laboratory analysis, investigators encountered a barrier that no technology could fully overcome. The challenge was not methodological, it was human. Identification required cooperation from families whose relationship with the military had been shaped not by reassurance, but by exclusion, neglect, and long memory. For many descendants of soldiers from the 92nd Infantry Division, the request for DNA did not arrive as an act of reconciliation. It arrived as a question, layered with doubt. Why now? Why after so many decades? What had changed and who benefited from reopening old wounds? These questions were not rhetorical. They reflected a history in which black military service had been demanded but not honored equally. Veterans returned from the Second World War to segregation, limited employment, and systemic barriers that contradicted the ideals they had been asked to defend. Families of the missing received even less. No bodies, no funerals, no recognition. Silence became protection. In this context, the DPAA requirement that at least half of identified families provide DNA before exhumation carried unintended weight. While designed as an ethical safeguard, it functioned as a test of collective trust. Progress depended not on evidence alone, but on willingness to engage with an institution that many families had learned to avoid. Some declined immediately. They did not dispute the goal. They disputed the process. One potential descendant expressed the hesitation plainly. If they find him, what happens then? Do we get answers, or just another letter? For investigators, these responses were familiar. They reflected patterns seen across cases involving segregated units. Families who had been historically marginalized were understandably cautious about reopening narratives in which they had been excluded. The Great Migration compounded these difficulties. As millions of African Americans moved from the rural South to northern cities, family networks fractured, names changed, records were lost. Oral histories were interrupted by the demands of adaptation. By the time modern genealogists attempted reconstruction, many branches had thinned beyond recognition. In some cases, descendants did not know they were descendants. This was not ignorance. It was consequence. Spike Lee's involvement altered the dynamic, but not the underlying tension. His decision to participate publicly did not erase mistrust. It reframed it. If someone with visibility and resources was willing to engage, others reconsidered. Not all agreed, but some paused. The human truth at the center of the case was not whether Maceo Walker deserved to be named. It was whether institutions that had failed him could now be trusted to finish the task. For Lee, the process was similarly complex. He was not grieving a known relative. He was absorbing responsibility for a loss he had never been taught to carry. The absence of memory created a different kind of burden. There was no personal grief to process, only an ethical obligation to respond. He described the experience as unsettling, not because it was emotional, but because it revealed a void. A person had existed, mattered, and disappeared, without leaving a trace in family consciousness. That absence was not accidental. It was structural. For DPAA staff, these realities shaped communication. Updates were cautious. Language was precise. Expectations were managed carefully. The goal was not persuasion, but respect. Families were not required to participate. Their consent had to be earned. This slowed the work. In parallel, investigators confronted the limits of what identification could achieve. Even if remains were named, history would not be rewritten. A headstone would not undo decades of silence. For some families, that limitation raised doubts about value. Was naming enough? The answer depended on perspective. For some, identification meant restoration. A name on a grave provided a focal point for memory. It allowed loss to be acknowledged rather than suspended. It offered a place to mourn. For others, it felt insufficient. The harm had already been done. Recognition arrived too late to heal those who had waited. Both reactions were valid. The Walker case became emblematic of this tension. It illustrated how historical injustice does not end when evidence is found. It persists in how that evidence is received. The process forced institutions to confront their own narratives. The missing were not lost solely to chaos. They were lost within systems that deprioritized certain lives. Recovery, therefore, required more than science. It required accountability. DPAA officials acknowledged this openly in internal discussions. The agency's mandate was technical, but its impact was social. Each identification carried implications beyond the individual. It signaled whose stories were worth revisiting. In that sense, the work was not neutral. Families who chose to participate did so with guarded hope. DNA samples were given without certainty of outcome. Trust was extended provisionally. The waiting resumed, but this time with awareness. What changed was orientation. Silence was no longer the default. Questions could be asked. Information could be requested. Even refusal became a form of agency. For the Walker family, this stage marked a shift from discovery to reckoning. Learning that Maceo existed was one thing. Engaging with the circumstances of his disappearance was another. It required confronting why no one had spoken his name and what that silence represented. The answer was not neglect within the family. It was inheritance shaped by constraint. Maceo Walker's absence had been absorbed into a broader pattern of loss that families learned not to articulate. War, segregation, economic precarity all demanded resilience. Silence was efficient. It conserved energy. It allowed forward movement. Modern recovery disrupted that efficiency. By asking families to remember the process, asked them to slow down, to reopen histories that had been deliberately compressed. That request carried emotional cost. Yet it also offered something new: validation. To be asked for DNA was to be acknowledged as relevant. To be consulted was to be recognized as part of history rather than outside it. For families long excluded from official narratives, that recognition mattered. This act of the story does not resolve mistrust. It situates it. Human truth in this context is not consensus. It is coexistence of belief and doubt. It is the understanding that recovery cannot be separated from history, and that science operates within social memory, not above it. As the Walker case approached potential resolution, the emotional landscape remained uneven. Hope existed alongside skepticism. Relief coexisted with anger. These were not contradictions. They were consequences. The identification of a single soldier could not repair generations of neglect, but it could interrupt the assumption that neglect was permanent. In that interruption lay meaning. This act does not close the case. It explains why closure is complicated. It reveals that the greatest barrier to naming the dead is not technological limitation, but the accumulated weight of how the living have been treated. Truth, when it arrives this late, does not arrive cleanly. It arrives burdened, and, acknowledging that burden is part of the work, resolution is often imagined as an event. In reality, it is a condition that arrives unevenly, if at all. For the case of Maceo A. Walker, the moment of potential resolution did not come with certainty or ceremony. It arrived instead as an extended interval of waiting, defined less by action than by restraint. The forensic process continued in laboratories far from the places where Walker had lived and died. Bone fragments were measured again. Genetic data was reviewed, compared, and reevaluated. Reports moved between specialists, each step governed by caution. Nothing was announced. In institutional terms, this stage was described as active analysis. In human terms, it was suspension. For the Walker family, newly aware of a relative they had never known, the waiting carried a different texture than grief. There was no memory to revisit, no shared stories to anchor anticipation. Instead, there was a growing awareness of absence layered onto absence. A man had existed. He had been lost. And now, decades later, his return was possible but not guaranteed. Waiting became a moral posture rather than a passive one. DPAA officials communicated periodically, but always within constraints. Language remained conditional. Probabilities were not presented as conclusions. The possibility of a negative or inconclusive result was acknowledged explicitly. Identification could fail. Evidence might not converge. The remains could remain unnamed. This transparency was deliberate. It reflected lessons learned from earlier cases where optimism had preceded proof. Here, expectation was managed carefully, not to diminish hope, but to protect it from collapse. The remains designated X124 remained in controlled storage. They were no longer anonymous, but not yet identified. They occupied a liminal status, neither unknown nor named, neither past nor returned. This condition mirrored the status Maceo Walker himself had occupied for most of his post-war existence. For DPAA staff, this parallel was not lost. Many described the work as accounting rather than discovery. The term emphasized responsibility over achievement. To account for someone was to acknowledge obligation even if outcome remained uncertain. Meanwhile, other cases from the 92nd Infantry Division remained unresolved. 50 soldiers were still officially unaccounted for. Each had a name. Each had a file. Many had no known living relatives willing or able to participate. Their cases remained technically open but practically stalled. The Walker case therefore did not stand alone. It was part of a larger landscape of incomplete reckonings. Public attention waxed and waned. Media interest spiked around milestones and receded during long periods of inactivity. This fluctuation contrasted sharply with the steadiness of the forensic process. Science did not respond to headlines. It responded to data. For Spike Lee, the waiting took on a reflective quality. He spoke sparingly about the case. When he did, he emphasized not outcome, but process. The fact that a search was happening mattered more than how it ended. A man had been acknowledged. That acknowledgement could not be undone. Yet even this position was provisional. What did it mean to welcome someone back when there had never been a departure ritual? How did a family integrate a loss retroactively? These questions had no procedural answers. They existed outside the scope of forensic science. Within the DPAA, discussions turned toward preparation. If identification were confirmed, protocols would follow. Notification of next of kin, coordination with the family, decisions about burial location, military honors, headstone inscription. Each of these steps assumed certainty that did not yet exist. At the same time, investigators prepared for the alternative. If identification could not be confirmed, the remains would retain their designation. The grave would remain marked as unknown. The effort would be documented, and the case would remain open. This outcome, too, required explanation. Families would need to understand that lack of confirmation did not imply failure or disinterest. It reflected the limits of evidence. For many families, that distinction mattered. The waiting period also revealed something about time itself. 70 years had already passed. A few more months or years altered nothing materially, yet they carried emotional weight. Each delay reminded families of how long acknowledgement had been postponed. Still, patience prevailed. What remained during this interval was not silence, but quiet attention. Files were no longer dormant. Names were no longer ignored. Even without resolution, the process itself had changed the historical record. Maceo Walker was no longer simply missing. He was being sought. This distinction mattered. In broader terms, ACTSIX represents the present tense of historical accountability. It is the phase most often omitted from narratives because it resists closure. There is no revelation, no confirmation, no final scene. There is only continuation. Yet continuation is itself meaningful. For institutions, it demonstrates sustained commitment rather than symbolic gesture. For families, it affirms that memory need not be complete to be valid. For history, it introduces uncertainty as an honest endpoint. Maceo Walker's story, at this stage, is not about recovery. It is about readiness. Readiness to accept an answer. Readiness to accept uncertainty. Readiness to carry a name forward, regardless of outcome. If identification is confirmed, a headstone will change. A grave will be marked differently. Military records will be amended. These acts will matter, but they will not erase the waiting that preceded them. If identification is not confirmed, the effort will still stand as a refusal to accept erasure. The search itself will remain part of the record. This is what remains when answers are delayed in tension. For the Walker family, intention takes the form of awareness. They now know that someone was lost. They know his name. They know where he likely fell. Even without certainty, that knowledge reshapes family history. For the DPAA, intention takes the form of persistence. Cases are revisited not because success is guaranteed, but because neglect is unacceptable. For history, intention takes the form of interruption. The assumption that some losses are permanent is no longer uncontested. ACTSIX does not conclude the narrative. It holds it in suspension. It insists that waiting is not emptiness, but labor. Maceo A. Walker remains at this moment between categories. Not missing in the way he once was. Not returned in the way his family might hope. He exists in the present as a question actively being addressed. That condition, though unresolved, represents a form of justice previously denied. What remains is not an answer, but the refusal to stop asking. If a name is finally carved into stone, it will not complete the story. It will only change its weight. For decades, Maceo A. Walker existed as absence, first on a battlefield, then in records, then in family memory. His disappearance was never dramatic. It was procedural, incremental, and therefore easy to accept as permanent. What this case has shown is that permanence is often a choice made by systems, not a fact imposed by time. To call his name now is not to reverse history, but to refuse its quietest failure. It is to acknowledge that loss without recognition is a second kind of erasure, one that extends beyond death into meaning. Whether the remains known as X124 are ultimately confirmed as his, does not alter the central truth that has already emerged. Maceo Walker lived. He served. He was lost in conditions shaped by war and inequality. And for more than 70 years, that loss went largely unexamined. There are others like him, names still dormant, files still open, families still unaware of what they are missing. History rarely resolves itself cleanly. Sometimes it echoes instead softly, insistently, waiting for someone to listen long enough to answer back.